The illustration for May shows a chevalier similar to the one we saw for April, but here his horse is densely decked with foliage rather than being decorated with ribbons. In April, he was peering into the forest. Here he gallops in, followed by his hunting dogs. The birds here are amorously involved, the brighter males preening. Above, the sign of Gemini, more typically given as happy twin children or youths, instead is shown as a scene of bitter sibling rivalry, the left-hand brother smiling in triumph while the one on the right bows his head to weep. The Angevin Bible Explained, source of the scriptural vignettes that run through the Rohan, here shows God creating the various animals and making humanity in his own image. Jesus, the creator aspect of the Trinity, has put Adam to sleep to create Eve from one of his ribs. In European art, this was early on interpreted as a kind of lateral C-section. Note the centaur among the animals, cribbed from the sign Sagittarius, and of a piece with the mermaid we saw earlier in the creation of the fish. Classical mythology was accepted in the Middle Ages as natural history. The text informs us that Adam's sleep signifies Christ on the cross entering the sleep of death. Eve emerging from Adam's side is Holy Church born from the wound in Jesus' side. The animals represent the world's other religions. Christ is the second Adam, undoing Adam's fall by his own self-sacrifice. Similarly, the creation of Eve foreshadowed the birth of the Church from Christ's wounds. At bottom, we see the Church fully realized, manifesting the potential of the naked spirit that emerged from Jesus' side. The creation of man and of the animals is given by the Rohan much as we have it in the Angevin, but Eve was painted in, then painted back out, evincing perhaps a Gnostic horror at birth into the material world. Adam's right hip was never repainted, just covered over with hillside green, and we can make out Eve's lighter silhouette against the sky. In the answering illustration, the Church's birth from Christ's side has similarly been edited out, and the calm, anesthetized sleep of the Angevin Christ has been replaced by a last moment of woe. On the seventh day, God surveyed all the different days and saw that his work was done. The division of labors doesn't precisely follow the day-by-day chronicle in Genesis, though it does have its own logic. What we have here, beginning at bottom right, is the separation of light from darkness. To the immediate left, the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. Above this, the separation of earth and sea. Then to the right, the creation of the fish. Above the day spheres, we have the creation of the animals and of man. Mankind adores its creator, while two of the animals, perhaps dogs, are coupling. God looks on with an expression of genial indulgence. God resting on the seventh day prefigures how Jesus Christ will rest from all his works on the day of judgment, receiving his friends into heaven and trampling his enemies down into hell. Note the hell-mouth breathing red fire, into which the enthroned Christ in majesty treads the damned. Their slack, dead expressions indicate that they have lost eternal life. The Rohan gives us essentially the same image, but here the birds are amusingly perched, one on a day sphere, two others on the frame of the picture. The Last Judgment is more elegantly realized, though with a less convincing hellmouth. God planted the Garden of Eden, filling it with both good trees and sharp brambles, perhaps to indicate that some caution was needed even here. In the midst of the garden he planted the tree of life. Wonderfully, the tree of life bears fruit in the form of human heads. The idea seems to be that this fruit doesn't just nourish, but transforms as though it had a will of its own. The moral here is that the good trees represent good people who busy themselves with good works. These will be crowned with flowers in paradise. The spiny brambles are bad people who accomplish evil deeds. They will be crowned with the thorns they earned in their worldly existence. Note the smug expressions on the worldly persons. they have no idea what they're in for. The Rohan rendering of Eden adds a little extra grotesqueness with its more realistic vegetable heads. The Rohan treatment of the just and the wicked is clearer graphically, but rather less subtle. For June, we see a peasant mowing a meadow with a scythe. He has taken off his shoes because of the heat. His dog and his wine cask lie beside them. In one of the witty touches which sometimes enliven this dour book of ours, the trees of modern France blend into those of paradise. The artist's delight in rendering the seasons allowed this subtle endorsement of the material world. Overhead, the sign of Cancer is represented by a crayfish. Here God puts Adam to sleep and draws Eve from his side, crowned with 12 stars. What really needs explanation here is Eve's crown of stars. Eve plays a key role in the drama of salvation as the mother of the human race and the precursor of Mary, aspects which feminists tend to miss when they ponder Christian mythology. And this is part of what earns her the heavenly crown. The number 12 evokes the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, but more important than the precise number is the astral character this adornment gives her. Eve embodies the archetype of the fertility goddess, who is described as queen of heaven and earth, for the birds as well as the animals owe their birth to her. Of course, the artist here was consciously thinking only of Eve as the precursor of Mary in her Queen of Heaven aspect, but this medieval art is really latest antique art, as the zodiac signs, centaurs, and mermaids attest. Thus Eve appears as a palimpsest of great mother iconography, with recollections of Isis and Aphrodite glimmering through. Adam's sleep prefigures the death of Christ on the cross. God drawing Eve from Adam's side foreshadows the church emerging, crowned and ready to rule, from the wounded side of Christ. The church shines with God's favor and is adored by good Christians. In the Rohan, the birth of Eve is represented with startling vividness. The tension of Eve's body as she is pulled into existence, her agonized expression, and her crown of stars like a radiation of pain make her seem a spiritual being who is dragged unwilling into the woe of physical existence. In the pendant, the attitudes are reversed. The female spirit, hands raised in celebration, is liberated from the heavy bonds of the flesh. Note the blood-red light shining down from heaven, bathing the figures in metaphoric gore. The motif of Christ giving birth through his side wound, reflected back onto Adam and Eve, has its own logic. Since Mary, the great female archetype of Christian mythology, is so pointedly virgin, she could not be given all the attributes of a fertility goddess. Her sexuality was displaced onto Christ's wound, which was venerated independently, as we see in this page from the 1349 Psalter of Bonne de Luxembourg. This abstracted, yoni-like wound is a commonplace in books of ours, especially after printing made them more responsive to popular taste. This late 15th century German woodcut, describing in detail the measurements of Christ's body and his wound, gives a good impression of how clinically fascinating the theme became. July is a splendid evocation of summer's height. The dog is dozing in the heat. The reapers wear only light shirts and kerchiefs as they work, while the sign of Leo blazes overhead like another sun. In the Angevin, God joins Adam and Eve in marriage, which foreshadows how Christ, having completed his earthly mission, took the church as his eternal bride. The Rohan has lost Eve's face, which would have been the most interesting part of this picture. Our interpretation is stymied without it. The Rohan's marriage of God and the church is more courtly and affectionate than the somewhat hieratic scene we had in the Angevin. Here comes the serpent to deceive Eve. Now Adam will forfeit all the good things God has given them. This is an unusually fine temptation. The serpent's tail ends in elaborate coils, suggesting the subtlety and complexity of his words. He has 2 heads, for he is duplicitous. Eve is already won over and is trustingly tasting, while Adam stares at the fruit with a hand on his throat to show he is already considering the fatal action. Adam and Eve, tricked into sinning by the devil, suggest the physical desires which deceive people into doing the devil's will. The devil rewards them by fastening his cords around every part of their bodies. In the end, he will use these to haul them down into hell. Again, a magnificent illustration, with the lovers looking grimly serious as they consummate their illicit passion. The devil watches with purest delight as he winds his toils about them. Delicate as they are at first, every thread will become a cord, and every cord a cable, as sin becomes habitual. In the Rohan, the serpent is far more dragon-like, with 4 legs by which it clambers up the tree. Its heads are differentiated. The benign face of a bearded sage looks down on trusting Eve, while a menacing reptile head lowers over Adam and his sad misgivings. While the Angevin devil ensnared the illicit lovers with gossamer, here a far more monstrous devil nets them in their own bedsheet. The wattlework shed they have chosen for their tryst is the one used by the threshers in the August illustration. In August, the harvested grain is threshed in an open-air shed. The sheaves are first beaten with a flail to separate the seeds from their stalks. Then the seeds are further cleaned in a winnowing basket in which the grain is tossed so the lighter chaff can blow away. In the sky, Virgo holds 2 palm branches, emblems of victory usually shown in the hands of Christian martyrs. It seems as though Virgo had seized upon these celestial accessories to mime the granary work which takes place under her.